All right, hi friends, back to you reading Ivy and Bean today. We're going to be reading 7 and 8 unless we feel it's a little bit too long. So here I am reading with you. Easy peasy. Now they were ready to begin. Ivy went to the bedroom section of her room and pulled a cardboard box out from under her bed. Then she looked at Bean. This part is really secret, she said. I promise I won't tell anyone, said Bean. Ivy opened the box and took out a square thing wrapped in pink, silky cloth. It was her spell book. Bean thought that a spell book would be mysterious looking, with a magic sun on the cover or something. But this spell book was plain black. It was old, though. Ivy said it was almost 100 years old. The pages were yellowish. Where'd you get it? Bean whispered. My aunt gave it to me, Ivy said. Is she one? Asked Bean. She says she isn't, said Ivy, but I'm not sure. Ivy flipped through the book for the dancing spell. She read it to herself, and then she whispered it, but so low that Bean couldn't hear. Bean didn't mind. Everyone knew that witches' spells were private. After a few minutes, Ivy said, Got it. It's a pretty easy spell. The only thing we need is worms. Luckily, there were lots of worms in Bean's backyard, tons, but now they were going to have to sneak into Bean's yard and dig them up without Nancy seeing. But also, luckily, Bean knew how to get into her yard by going through the other backyards on Pancake Court. There was one really gross dog poopy yard, and there was Mrs. Trance who didn't like kids in her garden, and there was a lot of climbing. But aside from that, Bean said it was easy peasy. Ivy put the big black book in her backpack. Bean tucked the wand into her back pocket. It was still a little drippy, but there was nothing Bean could do about that. Carefully, they tiptoed down the stairs. Ivy's mother was still working in her office, and they slipped past her door like quiet ants. Soon, they were moving quickly toward the back fence. You see, boys and girls, right here, it says slipped past her door like quiet ants. That's figurative language. It's a simile. It uses the word like, so it gives an example of how quiet they are, just like ants. I don't know how often you hear them, but I never hear ants. They're very quiet. It was a good analogy. Ivy, Ivy Bean, Ivy Bean saw, did not really know. Ivy Bean saw that Ivy did not really know how to climb a fence. She just jumped. She just jumped at it, hoping that she would get to the top. Bean showed her how to find the little holes and bumps that make a ladder. Then when they got to the top, Bean whispered, "This is Ruby and Trevor's house. They have a good sandbox." The good news was that there was a gate on the other side of Ruby and Trevor's yard. The bad news was that it led to the really gross dog poopy yard. Bean and Ivy walked on tiptoes, but still Ivy stepped in some. Fester, the dog whose poop it was, came out to sniff them. He was a nice dog, and he seemed sorry that his yard was so disgusting. The fence was low and easy, except that the wand fell out of Bean's pocket, and she had to go back and get it. Then came Jake the teenager's house. There was loud music with lots of bad words in it coming from the garage. There was no way Jake the teenager was ever going to hear them walking through his backyard. Mrs. Trance was next. Getting into her yard was no problem. Ivy and Bean climbed over the stone wall and dropped down onto her lawn. Everything in Mrs. Trance's yard was perfectly neat. Her tulips were lined up in rows, her apple tree was tied so the branches grew flat, her bird bath had no birds in it. If Mrs. Trance sees us, she's going to be really mad, said Bean. Bean knew this garden. It was very long, and there was no way to get around it. Is she going to throw rocks at us? Asked Ivy. She looked a little scared. No, she just talks, but it's worse than throwing rocks, Bean sighed. Maybe she's not home. But Mrs. Trance was home. They were halfway across her perfect yard when she came outside. She stood on her patio and glared at them. "Bernice," she said in a high voice, "come here." Bean took a few steps towards the patio. "Closer, please, Bernice. It seems that we need to have another one of our little talks." Ivy came and stood beside Bean next to the patio. "Who are you?" said Mrs. Trance, frowning at Ivy's white witch face. "My name is Ivy," said Ivy. "Well, Ivy, children are not allowed in my garden. Maybe you can teach your friend Bernice that." Mrs. Trance gave her a short, dry laugh. "Because Bernice does not seem to be able to remember it by herself. Do you, Bernice? Let's think about this. Who is Mrs. Trance like? A few weeks ago, we read a story of Peter Rabbit, who also didn't like someone in their garden. Do you remember? Oh, I think someone got it. Mr. McGregor. He also didn't like people in his garden. Maybe Mrs. Trance and Mr. McGregor would get along." "I remember, Mrs. Trance, but it was just sort of an emergency," said Bean. "I'm sorry." "Usually, when you say you're sorry, people say something nice back to you. Not Mrs. Trance. She said, 'I don't think you're sorry, Bernice. If you were sorry, you wouldn't keep coming into my garden when I have asked you not to. Do I need to call your mother again?" She smiled in an unfriendly way. Bean heard Ivy sucking in her breath. "She's about to do something," thought Bean. "I'm going to throw up," Ivy said loudly. "Yuck," thought Bean, whirling around to see. Ivy looked at her and crossed one eye a teeny bit. Bean looked closely at Ivy. Then she said, "That's the emergency I was telling you about, Mrs. Trance." Mrs. Trance looked worried. Ivy burped. It sounded horrible. Mrs. Trance jumped back. "Go, go, go home, run." "That's what we were trying to do, Mrs. Trance," Bean said sweetly. She was having a good time watching Mrs. Trance's face. "Go, now," yelled Mrs. Trance. Ivy gagged. Mrs. Trance ran inside her house and looked at them through a window. She waggled her hand to shoo them away. "Well, we'll be going now," Mrs. Trance called Bean. She waved goodbye as she and Ivy walked away. Ivy gave one more disgusting burp, just for fun. Bean tried to hold her laughs in, but they came out her nose, and then Ivy couldn't hold her laughs in either. It was a good thing they were in the next yard by then. It really was easy peasy after that. They went across Kyla's yard. Kyla was in her high chair at the kitchen window. She waved her spoon at Bean. Bean waved back and put her fingers to her lips. "Shh," she whispered. Finally, they came to Bean's own yard. Wow, that was an adventure, running across yards. Who could imagine all the things that they saw? All right, next chapter, Bean's backyard. "You peek over. See if Nancy's there," said Bean. "She might be in the yard looking for me." Ivy nodded and stood up. She could just see over the fence. "I don't see anyone," she said. "Then they're probably out looking for more," said Bean. She pictured her mom and Nancy with worried faces. "I've been gone for a long time." "Let's get the worms," said Ivy, pulling herself over the fence. Bean's backyard was a big rectangle. There was a nice part with flowers and neat grass. And then there was a messy part with lumpy grass and a trampoline and a playhouse that Bean had since she was little. She could barely fit inside it anymore. There was stuff lying all over the messy part: hula hoops, balls, arrows, shovels, buckets, and a broken stilt. Bean had really hurt herself that time. The worms were in the messy part, over next to the playhouse, where the ground was wet. Ivy and Bean grabbed shovels and a bucket and got to work. At first, there was just a lot of mud. Then there was mud and a few worms. But the more they dug, the more worms they found. 6, 10, 13 worms. The worms oozed and curled around through the mud. Bean liked the way they were they were fat one second and stretched out and skinny the next. She and Ivy dug deeper and deeper until they made a big, muddy pit in the ground. It was almost 2 feet across, and water dribbled down the sides. Worms were squirming at the bottom of the pit, trying to get away. Bean felt a little sorry for them, but Ivy just picked them up and dumped them into the bucket. Bean thought of Nancy kicking and waggling, and she began dumping them into the bucket too. How many do we need? Asked Bean. The worms were piled on top of one another on the bottom of the bucket. Ivy looked. Only 10, but the more worms we have, the harder she'll dance. This is enough, said Bean. Poor worms. All right, said Ivy. She looked toward Bean's house. Let's go see if your sister is home. Okay, but we better sneak, said Bean. Bean's house was good for sneaking. At the back, there was a porch. If you crawled like a bug across the porch, you could look through a big window into the kitchen. The girls ran toward the bushes that grew next to Bean's porch and ducked down hiding. Quietly, they began to creep up the stairs that led to the porch. Very quietly, they crawled across the floor, and then Bean heard a sound. She froze. There it was again. A sob. It was someone crying. Bean listened. It sounded like Nancy. Bean put her hand on Ivy's arm and pointed to the window. They crawled to it and peered in like spies. There was Nancy. She was sitting at the kitchen table. She was alone. She was crying. Bean got a funny feeling. Nancy was usually so bossy, so nosy, so sure she was right. It was weird to see her cry all alone. Maybe she's crying because she thinks you're lost, whispered Ivy. That's kind of nice. Bean didn't answer. She had never thought that she could make Nancy cry. Bean felt a lump in her throat. She remembered that Nancy let her snuggle into her bed when she had bad dreams about the spooky man. She remembered that Nancy let her play with her glass animals sometimes, even after she had broken the starfish. She remembered that Nancy had once bought her a fairy coloring book with her own money. Bean looked at the tears rolling down Nancy's cheeks. Poor Nancy, Bean sniffed. Maybe she didn't want to put the dancing spell on her sister after all. Aw, I wonder why she's so sad. Can you think of a reason why you might be sad? Let's see what our characters do. Nancy said something. Bean couldn't hear it, but she was sure it was something about her missing. What? Said Bean's mother's voice from another room. Everybody has them, Nancy shouted. Everybody but me. I'm the only one who has to wait. She began to cry harder. What? Bean pressed her face against the window. Her mother's voice said, We've talked about this a million times. You can have them when you're 12. Even some of Bean's stupid friends have them, yelled Nancy. Suddenly, Bean knew what Nancy was crying about. She's not sad about me at all. She's crying about pierced ears. Bean hissed Bean to Ivy. Bean got mad, really mad. She was even madder than she had been when Nancy tried to drag her into the house. Bean was so mad she forgot all about being sneaky. She stood up and banged on the window with her fist. You're being a big turkey, she yelled. Nancy stared and then jumped up. Hey, Mom, Bean's back. Get her in here, Bean breath. She flashed out the back door before Bean could even begin to run. In 2 seconds flash, she had Bean by the arms and was pulling her in the door. Just wait till Mom gets a hold of you, she was saying. You're going to be in so much trouble. Stop, yelled Ivy. She stood in front of Nancy, waving the wand at her face. I command you to free Bean. Ooh. Her friend Ivy to the rescue. All right, boys and girls, those are 2 chapters. Excuse me. I'm going to take a break, get some water, and I'll be back to read you the next 2. Let me see how I turn this off.